All right, hello and welcome to the video. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is the idea of philosophy as a universal human quest. And this is definitely not the type of introduction you had if you took like a philosophy 101 in college. So we'll go over a bit of the overview, what the kind of the structure of this video will be. So more specifically, we're going to be taking a look at rethinking or restructuring the standard narrative of philosophy. And next, we'll take a look at some of the vocabulary of the three strains of philosophy. The main ones I'll be looking at are Indian, Greek, and Chinese traditions. Of course, there are others like Iranian, but we'll kind of weave those in here. But just for the sake of brevity, I guess you could say, it's already going to be a pretty long video. We're going to be looking at these three. Then we'll explore some of the differences between how these traditions answer some of the same fundamental questions. And next, we'll get clear about the similarities and the differences between these traditions. Finally, we'll close with some final remarks. And the entire goal of this video is to be a brief introduction to a series of videos that I'll be doing on the birth of philosophy in different parts of the world, basically after the Bronze Age collapse. And I don't think I've ever seen it quite posed or done in this way before. And I want to find, where and how these traditions that we know of as philosophy, where they came from, how they came about. And I'm going to do that by looking at some of the specific philosophers in each of these ancient traditions. So without further ado, let's kick off this series with an introduction to the problems and scope of global philosophy. So, about 3,000 years ago, in what is now northern India, a group of forest-dwelling sages began asking questions that would sound remarkably familiar to any modern philosophy student. These questions were like, what is ultimately real? How can we know anything for certain? What happens to consciousness after death? These weren't the first humans to wonder about these things, but they were among the first who approached them systematically, to build rigorous methods of investigation, and to record their findings for future generations. Around the same time, give or take a few centuries, similar conversations were happening in Greece and in China. Different languages, different cultures, widely different answers, but eerily similar questions. It's as if human consciousness, wherever it develops, sufficient complexity and with the amount of leisure time necessary to think about these things, it inevitably turns inward and starts interrogating itself. And this is philosophy, the disciplined attempt to understand ourselves, our world around us, and our place within that world. And despite what many Western textbooks suggest, and many courses in philosophy that you may have taken, it didn't begin with Socrates drinking the hemlock in an Athenian prison. Now, if you've taken a philosophy course before, you probably started with the ancient Greeks. Perhaps Thales claiming, everything is water, or Socrates insisting he knows nothing, or Heraclitus, or any of the Pre-Socratics. And then you moved through the Pre-Socratics to Socrates, through Plato's cave, into Aristotle's categories. You took a quick detour through some medieval theology, and eventually landed somewhere around Kant, Descartes, and, doubting everything around you. Descartes was doubting everything from his French fireplace, let's say. And this is sort of the standard narrative. Then you would go into the modern, 19th century, 20th century, and then contemporary, which is the end of 20th century and 21st century. And so this is the standard narrative, and it's not wrong exactly, but it's rather like studying world cuisine by only eating at French restaurants. It's excellent food, but you miss out on a lot of great food as well. And especially in the early parts, before things started to get sort of intermixed, let's say, there were these three ancient traditions. So today I want to kind of correct this imbalance, and with these series of videos, try to correct that imbalance with that goal in mind. So we're going to be looking at philosophy as a genuinely global human activity, one that emerged independently in multiple civilizations, each bringing their own insights and blind spots to certain eternal questions. Now, I want you to consider this. When the Greek philosophers were debating whether reality was made of fire or water, Indian thinkers had already spent centuries developing sophisticated theories of consciousness and elaborate systems of logic. When Confucius was teaching about social harmony in war-torn China, he was building on generations of earlier Chinese thought about how, the nature of rulership and what is virtue. And these aren't primitive precursors to quote-unquote real philosophy. They're mature intellectual traditions that would profoundly influence billions of people and continue to offer insights today. I mean, just think about if you go to modern China, people still have their Confucian roots and their sense of ethics from him. In philosophy courses in the West, we always start with the Greeks. I mean, it's not really doing philosophy if you don't get some sort of ancient Greek philosophy. And so that's where things get very interesting, but also a bit tricky. Because the very word philosophy itself comes from the Greek, meaning love of wisdom. And so when we apply it to, Indian darsana or Chinese thought, we're kind of already imposing a Western framework, aren't we? Because when the Indians speak of darsana, they mean something like seeing or vision. It's about a direct perception of truth, not just an intellectual understanding. And when the Chinese eventually coined the term xue xue, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Again, there are going to be some words in here that I don't completely pronounce correctly, but I'll give it a crack. So when when the Chinese eventually turned a coin for what they call philosophy, they were explicitly borrowing a Western concept to describe their own traditions. And these linguistic differences aren't trivial. They reveal fundamentally different approaches to wisdom itself, to knowledge even, and the Greeks conceived philosophy as a pursuit, a passionate quest for something not yet possessed, whereas the Indians saw it as a glimpse of something already present but hidden, and the Chinese approached it as a practical study of how to live well in society. Again, these aren't exclusionary. There is some Greek thought that was about the practical study and also about vision and perception, and they kind of intermix, but if we're just making a generalization, if you'll allow me that, this is kind of the basic division we could make. So, why should we care about these ancient disagreements? Well, because every time you make a decision about what's real, about what you can know or how you should act, you're unconsciously drawing on one or more of these traditions. That meditation app in your phone has roots back to Indian philosophical psychology. The scientific method you learned in school, that's pure Greek rationalism. And not pure, but it had its foundation in Greek rationalism. And the emphasis on social harmony and public service that you often hear from politicians, even in the West, it's got Chinese philosophy written all over it, all over the language and the sort of positions that they take. And this is whether they know it or not. So we're going to explore three great well springs of philosophical thought, each emerging from its own cultural soil, but addressing universal human concerns. First, we'll address the speculative inquiries of the late Vedic India, where sages sought to understand ultimate reality behind appearances. Second, we'll discover the rationalist revolution of pre-Socratic Greece, where thinkers first attempted to explain nature without invoking the gods. And third, the practical wisdom of ancient China's 100 schools of thought, where philosophers focused on urgent questions of how to create order from chaos. By beginning this journey not in Athens, but in the forest of ancient India, we're already making a statement here. The statement is that wisdom has multiple birthplaces, that no single culture has a monopoly on truth, and that sometimes to understand philosophy itself, we need to start from an unfamiliar place. But if you look at it chronologically, the earliest texts and sources that we have of this sort of philosophical thinking, of doing philosophy, does start about 1000 BCE in the forests of India. And then we get sort of simultaneous developments around 600 BCE in both China and Greece. So if you're ready, we'll begin with 3 words for wisdom and see how even the basic vocabulary of philosophy reveals radically different approaches to the fundamental questions of human existence. So, the very words we use to describe the activity of profound inquiry or philosophical investigation, if you will, They reveal distinct orientation and ultimate goals of each philosophical tradition. And I want to show you that what I mean by this by unpacking three terms: the Indian darsana, the Greek philosophia, and then the Chinese shui shui. Again, I'm probably slightly butchering the pronunciation, but you'll see the actual word on the screen here. So the main point is that each word is sort of a window into an entire worldview. So we'll start with the Indian view, darsana. And in Sanskrit, this word comes from the verbal root dars, meaning to see or to view or to look at. But this isn't a passive seeing like watching television or something. This is an active, transformative seeing. More like the moment when you suddenly understand a mathematical proof that's been puzzling you for hours, or you see sort of a logical deduction take place and you can you just see it happening. It's almost a feeling, but it's tied to vision. And, this sort of feeling is therefore applied to the nature of reality itself. Now, darsana has a fascinating dual meaning that tells you everything you need to know about Indian philosophy from the very get-go. In its everyday religious sense, darsana refers to auspicious sight of a deity or a holy person. When a devotee goes to a temple, they don't just visit the deity, they take darsana, if you will. And it's a two-way street. The devotee sees and is seen by the divine. There's an exchange of energy here, a moment of connection that's supposed to be transformative. But in its philosophical sense, darsana means like a viewpoint or even a school of philosophy, if you will, a view of philosophy, let's say. And within this viewpoint, there are 6 orthodox schools. There's the Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, the Samkhya, the Yoga, the Mimamsa, and the Vedanta. And these are collectively called, the 6 views, basically. And each one offers a different lens through which to perceive ultimate reality. And here's the crucial point here. An Indian darsana is not merely an academic subject you study in university. It's a complete way of life, a practical path called a marga, aimed at achieving a specific spiritual goal. And the purpose isn't intellectual satisfaction as much as it is, this may come along the way, but the purpose is more what they call moksha, which is liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Because they had this conception that you are continually reborn and die and reborn again. And from the fundamental suffering, they want to be liberated from this fundamental suffering that many Indian philosophers believe characterizes all of existence. And, this makes Indian philosophy fundamentally different from the modern Western discipline. You can't separate theory from practice here. You can't separate philosophy from spirituality, intellectual understanding from personal transformation. To study one of the 6 schools isn't just to understand, the concept that individual consciousness is identical to universal consciousness. It's to realize this truth experientially, to embody it and be transformed by it. And the origins of this sort of viewpoint, they trace back to the Upanishads, which were composed roughly between 1000 and 500 BCE. And these texts mark a pivotal shift in Indian thought. Because whereas the earlier Vedic tradition was all about ritual, precise sacrificial procedures to maintain a cosmic order, rather the Upanishadic sages, they ask questions like, what's the point of all these external rituals if we don't understand what we're doing internally? They turn the sacrificial fire inward, making consciousness itself the altar. And listen to one of their fundamental questions from one of the Upanishads. The question is, what is the cause? Brahman, whence are we born? Whereby do we live? And on what are we established? And these aren't just idle philosophical puzzles. These are more urgent questions whose answers determine how you live your entire life. So now we're going to cross to the ancient Greece and examine philosophia. Now, the word philosophia comes from philos, which means love, It's a certain type of love, and Sophia, which means wisdom. So a philosopher then is literally a lover of wisdom. And notice the difference immediately. Wisdom here is something you love, something you pursue, something you desire but don't fully possess. It's almost erotic in its intensity, this yearning for understanding. And in ancient Greece, this term was incredibly broad. What we now call physics or biology, psychology, mathematics, astronomy, these were all branches of philosophy. And it's very interesting because, I'll give you an example here. When Isaac Newton published his groundbreaking work in 1687, he called it Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which translates from Latin to Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Today we'd call it physics, but Newton understood himself to be doing natural philosophy. And it's actually a very interesting topic to look into, how certain branches of philosophy bubble up and then branch off and become their own science. It's happened with psychology. Back in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, people would just call it, philosophy of mind. And there is still philosophy of mind, but there was a certain segment of it that branched off and became a independent science. And biology the same way, again, physics. And so there are a lot of these subgroups or branches of philosophy that come up and then break off in their own. In fact, we're kind of witnessing one such event happen in the 21st century with ontology becoming its own sort of science in its own right, with the advancements of artificial intelligence and the need for categorizing large amounts of data. But again, that's for another time. To get back to the Greeks, the birth of Western philosophy as a distinct enterprise can be dated quite precisely to around the 6th century BCE in Miletus, which is a Greek city in what's now Turkey. And so here's what happened. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes made some radical moves. Instead of explaining earthquakes as Poseidon's anger or lightning as Zeus's thunderbolts, they looked for natural, rational explanations. They moved from mythos, or stories and myths, to logos, which is reason or a rational account. And their central project was to search for the arche, the origin, the fundamental substance, the ultimate principle from which everything derives. And Thales said it was water. Anaximander proposed something more abstract, the epeiron, which is like a boundless or infinity itself. Heraclitus thought it was fire, and but probably meant something more like process or change itself. Pythagoras made probably the most radical claim, which he said reality is fundamentally mathematical. And so think about what's happening here for a second. These Greeks are assuming that beneath the bewildering diversity of the world, rocks, trees, clouds, thunderstorms, humans, animals, plants, there's some underlying unity that human reason can discover, not through divine revelation, not through mystical experience, but through observation and logical thinking. And this is the birth of what we'd recognize as the scientific attitude. But there's something crucial here. This Greek philosophical project was fundamentally cosmological and secular. In other words, the Pre-Socratics weren't trying to achieve spiritual liberation or to understand their duties to the gods. They wanted to understand nature on its own terms. Philosophy was then the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, what Aristotle would later call the most free and noble of human activities because it serves no other purpose. And you could debate why this is and where these differences come from, but I will only leave you now with just the note that these differences were there. Where they come from or not is another question that maybe we'll explore in other videos, but these are sort of the fundamental origins of philosophical thinking in these two traditions and civilizations. So now we'll take a look at the third civilization, which is the Chinese study of wisdom. And The Chinese case is also particularly revealing because there's this modern word for philosophy in Chinese, and again, like I said, it's a recent import. It was coined in 1873 by actually a Japanese scholar, Amane, who created something to translate the Western concept of philosophy into Japanese using Chinese characters. And then the Chinese adopted this Japanese sort of neologism in the late 19th century when they began intensively engaging with Western thought. Because if you remember, throughout Chinese history, they would open up to the West and then they would get closed off again, whether, by their own doing or just, by happenstance. And so they were closed off for hundreds of years. But it's interesting etymologically, if you break the characters down, it's very beautiful because the first part, 解, means wise or wisdom, and 学 means study or learning. And so literally it's like wisdom learning. And it's a fitting translation, but again, notice it's a translation. They're borrowing a foreign concept to describe their own sort of indigenous traditions, if you will. And this raises a fascinating question. What are the Chinese doing for the previous 2,500 years, if not philosophy? They certainly had sophisticated intellectual traditions. The answer reveals something crucial about Chinese thought when you look into this. So, to give a bit of background, during the Warring States period, from roughly 475 to 221 BCE, China experienced a huge amount of political chaos, and it produced sort of an intellectual golden age called the 100 Schools of Thought. And, these thinkers weren't primarily asking what is the fundamental substance of reality or how can I escape the cycle of rebirth. They were asking more pressing concerns, more political concerns. How do we restore social order? What makes a good ruler? How should people treat each other? And again, you'll notice some overlap here with some of the ancient Greeks as well, and also with Indian philosophy, but they just placed more emphasis on these questions rather than personal individual salvation or what is the fundamental substance of reality. No, the Chinese school, rather, the Chinese philosophical tradition is fundamentally practical, ethical, and political. And, for example, Confucius wasn't interested as much in metaphysical speculation. When asked about death and the afterlife, he famously replied, "While you do not know life, how can you know about death?" So for him, philosophy was about ren, or humaneness, benevolence, and how to cultivate it in yourself and then in society. And the Taoists offered a radically different answer, but were equally as practical. Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching isn't really about the metaphysical nature of the Tao or the way. It's a manual for rulers on how to govern by Wu Wei, which is a non-coercive action that flows with the natural patterns rather than against them. And, even the legalist tradition in China, who seem probably the most cynical, were intensely practical nonetheless. They said, forget about cultivating virtue. Human nature is selfish, so create strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain order. Not very pretty, but undeniably focused on real-world applications. And so we have these three paths to wisdom, let's say, three words for wisdom or what doing philosophy is, and they each encode different assumptions about what philosophy is for. Darsana implies a direct transformative vision. The goal is to see reality correctly because correct seeing leads to liberation. Philosophy and spiritual practice are inseparable. They're almost the same thing. Philosophia, from the Greeks, implies passionate pursuit. The goal is to understand the cosmos through reason because knowledge itself is noble and good. Philosophy begins where mythology ends. And the Chinese approach implies practical study. The goal is to create individual and social harmony because we must live together in this world. Philosophy is ethics and politics before it's anything else. And so these aren't just different answers to the same questions. They're different conceptions of what questions are worth asking in the first place. And obviously there's some overlap in, certain philosophers from various regions asked the same questions. But overall, if you can get a generalized view of these three traditions, they place more emphasis on different questions. And then, therefore, they get various interesting answers to what they think is the most fundamental concerns. And that difference will shape everything that follows. It'll shape their metaphysics, their epistemology, their ethics. The Indian philosopher asks, how can I escape suffering? The Greek philosopher asks, what is the truth? And the Chinese ask, how should we live together in harmony? And all three are profound questions. All three deserve our attention. And maybe, just maybe, we need all three perspectives to approach anything like wisdom. So that'll bring us to part 3. Because, despite their diverse origins and cultural contexts, these philosophical traditions of India, Greece, and China converged a remarkably similar set of fundamental questions. And using the major branches of philosophy as our framework, I want to map out how each tradition grappled with the core problems of reality, knowledge, and human conduct. What's fascinating isn't just their different answers, but how their starting assumptions shaped what kinds of answers were even possible. So, every philosophical tradition eventually has to tackle the most basic question imaginable. What actually exists? What's genuinely real versus what merely appears to be? And, is there some fundamental unity behind the world's apparent diversity? Now, in Indian metaphysics, they take consciousness as sort of the foundation. And again, I'm applying metaphysics here, but as we'll see, they didn't necessarily call it metaphysics. In fact, metaphysics come from Aristotle, and it just means after the physics. So it just is the book that comes after Aristotle did everything he thought was about physics, and then everything else that was sort of outside of that, he just called metaphysics. But again, I think we can kind of make a classification here that this is something, they didn't call it metaphysics, but they were kind of doing something like metaphysics when they were asking these certain fundamental questions. So, Indian metaphysics, the Upanishads present one of the most radical metaphysical claims ever made. They assert that the ultimate reality, which they call Brahman, and individual consciousness, which is Atman, are identical. And the famous or great saying in Sanskrit, I believe, is that thou art. And this sort of encapsulates the view. You, in your deepest sense, in your deepest essence, are not different from the fundamental reality of the universe. But if everything is ultimately one consciousness, it poses the question, why does the world appear so diverse, so full of separate objects and beings? And the Indian answer is what they call Maya, or it's often translated as like illusion, but it's probably more better understood as the power that makes one appear as many. So the world isn't exactly fake. It's more like consciousness appearing to itself in countless forms, like a single actor playing all the parts in a play. And this leads to a distinctive Indian philosophical problem. If reality is one, why does suffering exist? And the answer that many sages give connects metaphysics directly to ethics and soteriology, because suffering comes from ignorance of our true nature. We think we're separate, limited beings, so we grasp, crave, and fear. Liberation comes from recognizing what we've always been, unlimited consciousness itself. Now, the Greeks took a completely different approach. The Pre-Socratics assumed reality was fundamentally material, not spiritual or consciousness or, a non-material substance or entity. So for the Pre-Socratics, many assumed reality was something like a material substance, and they tried to identify this basic substance. Many answers were given, like I mentioned earlier, water, air, fire, the infinite, and each proposal attempted to find the underlying stuff that could transform into everything else. And then came Parmenides with sort of a logical bomb. He kind of dropped the mic here and this sort of mic dropping would echo through Western philosophy for thousands of years. Using deductive reasoning, he argued that change is impossible. His logic was brutally simple. What exists, exists. What doesn't exist, doesn't exist. For something to change, it would have to become what it is not. But what is not doesn't exist, so there's nothing for it to become. Therefore, reality must be one, eternal, unchanging being. Everything else, all change, motion, diversity, is an illusion. Sounds pretty similar to the Indian answer, but again, notice it's not ultimate. Reality isn't eternal consciousness, it's unchanging being. It's still material. And again, we still get this sort of everything else is an illusion. That lines up pretty well with what the Upanishads, with that sort of view of metaphysics, but from a very different place, from a place of material. And this creates a fundamental tension in Western thought because between reason and experience. So our senses show us constant change. Logic suggests change is impossible. Heraclitus took the opposite position, declaring everything flows, that you can't step into the same river twice, you're not the same man, and the river isn't the same river. Reality isn't a thing, but a process held in dynamic tension by opposing forces, basically. And so these early Greek debates established the terms for 2,500 years of Western metaphysics. The same questions that they were dealing with, we still deal with now. You can go to any philosophy journal now and find somebody, trying to, or answering the question or talking about, is reality fundamentally mental or physical? Is there one or is there many? Is there change or is it all permanence? Is it a substance or is it a process? And so these debates still happen today, and we rehash similar answers. And how much progress has been done since the ancient Greeks is definitely not settled by any means. So we'll move on to the Chinese metaphysics, and they developed a third option. Reality isn't static substance like in Greece. It's not pure consciousness like in India, but a dynamic process called the Tao, or the way. The Tao isn't a thing, it's the spontaneous natural pattern by which everything unfolds. Everything in the universe consists of qi, which is often translated as energy, but probably better understood as like a matter-energy process. It's like vitalistic energy. The energy that gives, animation to material things. And qi isn't, static stuff, but a dynamic transformation, constantly shifting between yin, which is sort of the passive, receptive, darkness, and yang, which is more the active, creative lightness, and shifting between these two aspects. And these weren't substances, but phases. It's like how water can be ice or steam. This is sort of how they kind of thought of the dynamic process. Now, notice how practical this is. While Indians sought to escape the world and the Greeks to understand it theoretically, the Chinese wanted to harmonize with its patterns, to discover those patterns and then attune themselves with them. And if you understand how yin and yang alternate, you can act at the right moment with minimal effort. This is the principle of Wu Wei, which is like effortless action. And so, if those are the different realities, the question becomes, how can we know them? What counts as valid knowledge versus mere opinion or delusion? Now, Indian philosophers developed perhaps the world's most systematic epistemology through their theory of pramanas, which means valid means of knowledge. And different schools accepted different, numbers or different. One of these four differences they accepted. Some have accepted all of them. Some accepted one out of the four or two. So they kind of mix and match. But the four most recognized, at least, are perception, inference, comparison, and testimony. And what's distinctive here is the inclusion of testimony as a fundamental source of knowledge. Western philosophy tends to be suspicious of authority, but Indian philosophers argued that most of what we know, like history, geography, even our own names, basically, it comes from testimony. That, the key is determining which sources are reliable. But you have to remember here, in the Indian context, knowledge isn't valuable for its own sake. It's valuable insofar it leads to liberation. You need correct knowledge to dispel the ignorance that causes suffering. And so epistemology serves soteriology. Now, the Greeks made a distinction that would become fundamental to Western thought. And this distinction is between opinion and belief, which is doxa, versus episteme, which is knowledge and understanding. Doxa is what most people think, the conventional wisdom, our everyday assumptions. And episteme is genuine knowledge, justified, certain, demonstrable knowledge. And Parmenides articulated this probably most starkly when he distinguished the way of the truth, which is like revealed by reason, and he distinguished the way of the truth from the way of opinion, which is the way of opinion is based on sensory experience. And this set up the great Western epistemological debate, reason or rationalism versus experience. And, it tries to answer the question, do we know through pure reason or through sensory experience? And this Greek innovation, the systematic doubt, critical examination, demanding justification for beliefs, created what we recognize as the scientific attitude. Don't just accept, investigate. Don't just assert, argue. Don't just believe, but prove. Now, the Chinese approach features, or rather frustrates Western philosophers because it refuses to separate knowledge from action. The Chinese word "chi" means both to know and to realize or to actualize. You don't really know something until you can do it. And Wang Yangming's famous doctrine of the unity of knowledge and action captures this perfectly. He was a philosopher, argued that the good and doing the good are one act. If you claim to know something is right but don't do it, you don't really know it. You just have information about it. So Chinese epistemology is about developing practical wisdom, knowing when to act, how to read certain situations, and how to respond appropriately. It's less, is this proposition true? And more, does this work in practice? Knowledge is skill, not theory. And so perhaps the most pressing questions, like I said earlier, some of these epistemological claims sort of go into ethical and political stuff, especially in the Chinese tradition. And some of the most pressing questions here are: how should we live? What are our duties to others, and what makes a just society? So I'll go through some of the three answers to this given by the different traditions here. So for Indian ethics, it operates through two key concepts, which is karma. I'm sure you probably heard of this one. It's the law of moral cause and effect. Every action creates consequences that will inevitably return to you in this life or in future ones. It's not punishment or reward from a deity. It's more of like an impersonal law, like gravity almost. It's karma. Dharma is a bit more complex. It means sort of the duty or righteousness, the moral order itself. Your dharma depends on your stage of life and social position. A student's dharma differs from a householder's dharma, a merchant's dharma from a warrior's dharma. So in this light, ethics isn't a universal role or rule, but it has contextual responsibilities. And this creates a sophisticated situational ethics. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the central drama, comes from exactly this complexity. When duties conflict, what do you do? The answer involves understanding the deeper principles behind specific duties and why they're conflicting. To a lot of modern audiences, it would make no sense why some of the problems you see in the Bhagavad Gita are problems at all. But if you come from this ethical tradition, you see it in a different lens. Now, moving on to the Greeks, early Greek ethics was cosmological. So for Heraclitus, for example, living well meant aligning yourself with the logos. The rational principle governing change. This is the logos. Justice wasn't human convention, but kind of like a cosmic balance. And later philosophers would make ethics more personal and systematic. For example, Socrates' radical claim was that virtue is knowledge. People do wrong only through ignorance. Plato developed this into a theory of the soul's parts and their proper ordering. Aristotle created virtue ethics, focusing on character development and human flourishing, or eudaimonia. And the Greeks gave us the idea that ethics could be rational, that moral principles could be discovered through reason rather than simply inherited from tradition or decreed by the gods. And so that brings us to the Chinese ethics and the great debate within that. Because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the philosophical developments in ancient Chinese philosophy happened during the Warring States period, and which produced, a magnificent debate about human nature and social order. There were Confucians arguing that humans are basically good but need cultivation. And they get this through ritual and study and moral development. And through these things, we can create harmonious societies based on benevolence and righteousness. Now, the Taoists rejected this entirely. They said trying to be moral makes things worse. Drop the artificial standards, return to natural simplicity, and problems solve themselves. Morality is what happens when we've already lost the way, the Tao. Now, legalists, on the other hand, were more grimly realistic. They thought that humans were selfish and moral cultivation is just a pure fantasy. Can't happen. So the only way to control society and make it better for everybody is through strict laws, harsh punishments, and absolute state power. This is the only way that can create order. Now, the Mohists, which is probably the fourth most important tradition, or one of the four most important traditions, they advocated universal love. It may sound sort of hippie-ish, but and even Indian. A lot of the hippie movement was inspired by Indian philosophy. People going over to India, but the Mohist tradition in Chinese has this as well, where you treat everyone's welfare as equally important. And, it's a pretty radical idea, but how practical is that? It's pretty difficult to actually put in practice. But the point in all this is that, the debate for the Chinese wasn't purely academic or theoretical. Rulers were actively experimenting with these philosophies. They were putting them into practice, into action. And, they had China's future at stake. So it was, sort of live by the sword, die by the sword sort of thing. If whatever ethical standard you went with, that's what you were judged on, and you would have to completely shift the society's ethical sort of standard, basically. So moving on, we're going to step back just slightly and sort of notice some remarkable patterns here. Each tradition's metaphysics shapes its epistemology, which shapes its ethics. So for the Indians, they see reality as consciousness, they seek knowledge to escape illusion, and structure ethics around liberation. Greeks see reality as substance or form. They seek knowledge, so they seek rational knowledge of that structure and base ethics on reason and virtue. The Chinese see reality as a process. They seek practical wisdom about patterns within that process and focus their ethics on social harmony. And so these aren't just different answers, they're different ways of connecting the fundamental questions or answering the fundamental questions. And maybe that's the deepest philosophical insight here. The questions are universal, they're all there. People answer or ask very similar questions all around the world, which didn't have very much contact with each other. But how we connect them, how we prioritize them, and where we seek answers, that's where cultures diverge and where we have the most to learn from each other. So that brings me to part 4 here, which is the more delicate work, let's say. We've seen 3 magnificent philosophical traditions. Again, just a brief sort of sketch outline of the basic metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. Obviously, there's more things to say about their aesthetics, about their value theory, about all these different things. But this just gives us a basic understanding of these three schools or traditions. And we've seen how they each have their own vocabulary, they have their own concerns and methods. And the temptation is either to force them into artificial unity. They're all kind of saying the same thing, or they overlap so much that they just had different priorities, or to kind of just wall them off as incompatible worldviews that can never speak to each other. Both approaches, I think, are a mistake. So I'll be direct about the sort of challenge we face, because it's been about 100 years since the world has kind of opened up and everybody's been sort of, commingling both academically and, we've had the means of transportation enough to go around the world. And we're still sort of lagging behind in sort of bringing these three, at least philosophical traditions, comparing them, seeing how they differ and how they're the same. And the problem is compounded by the fact that when we use Western philosophical categories like metaphysics or epistemology to analyze Indian and Chinese thought, we're sort of already imposing a foreign framework onto these different traditions. These categories emerged from specific Greek concerns and may not map neatly onto other traditions. I say that here just as a easier means of trying to compare them. But if you consider like Confucian Ren, for example, is it really ethics in the Western sense, or is it something else, more like a cosmic principle or a psychological state or a social force? When the Taoists speak of Wu Wei, which is non-action or efficient action, are they making a metaphysical claim? Are they offering ethical advice or describing a psychological technique? And the answer is probably all of the above, which again shows how hard these traditions are to resist our neat categorizations or our Greek-inspired categorizations. So, and to make matters even worse, the translation itself is problematic. So, for example, take the Sanskrit dharma. We might translate it as duty or law or righteousness or religion or the way things are. And each translation highlights certain aspects while obscuring others. The word carries associations and resonances in Sanskrit that no English word can fully capture. And so when we translate, we're already interpreting and making philosophical choices, basically. Now, it's not all bad news, because even despite these difficulties, comparison remains possible, and I think more importantly, valuable when we compare in the right way with an amount of intellectual honesty and the right attitude coming to the table. Because I think beneath the diverse vocabularies and the cultural forms and the different prioritizations of these different fundamental questions, we find recognizably human concerns, right? Every tradition wrestles with suffering and how to address it. Every tradition seeks reliable knowledge. Every tradition struggles with how humans and individuals and persons should relate to society and to one another. But, and this is crucial, they don't all define these problems the same way. For Indian philosophy, suffering, is the fundamental problem. It's built into the very nature or structure of existence. For Greek philosophy, ignorance is the fundamental problem, with suffering as one of its consequences, right? So for Indians, suffering is a fundamental problem with ignorance as one of its consequences. In Greek, fundamental problem is ignorance with suffering as one of its consequences. And in Chinese philosophy, social disorder is the fundamental problem, or one of the fundamental problems, with individual suffering as a symptom of that. So these aren't just different emphases, they're different diagnoses that lead to different prescriptions. If suffering is metaphysical, you need spiritual liberation. If suffering comes from ignorance, you need education and reason. If suffering comes from social disorder, you need better governance and ethics. And here's a trap that I think we should avoid given this situation. the well-meaning but misguided claim that, sort of all religions or philosophies, they sort of they're getting at the same thing, or that they're equally valuable as one another. And I would avoid that temptation, because a Buddhist pursuing nirvana is not seeking the same thing as a Confucian cultivating humaneness, or a Platonist contemplating the forms. And these differences matter very much. When we pretend they don't exist or pretend that they're all equal, we're not being respectful, we're being patronizing. And we're essentially saying your tradition doesn't really mean what it says it means, or that, it means what I think it should mean, or something like that. This kind of false universalism flattens out precisely what makes each tradition valuable, and the value that they have in answering certain questions. And the answer that you're looking for will give you a different prioritization structure based on these different traditions. It's not all one-to-one. So, the Indian emphasis on consciousness as fundamental offers dramatically different insights that materialism misses. The Greek commitment to reason and logic provides tools that purely experiential approach lacks. And the Chinese focus on harmony in relationships highlights dimensions of ethics that individual-centered philosophies completely overlook. So, I'll briefly touch on sort of the value of this philosophical diversity and recognizing them as diverse and not all equal, basically. So think of humanity's philosophical traditions as different experiments in living and thinking and acting. Each tradition has spent millennia developing its approach, testing it against experience, refining its methods. Why would we want to collapse this diversity into uniformity? It makes no sense. Consider how each tradition might approach a contemporary issue like artificial intelligence. An Indian philosopher might ask, what is the relationship between the artificial and the natural, or the artificial consciousness and natural consciousness? Can a machine achieve liberation? Does it feel suffering? Does AI have a sort of a karma? And that's not to trivialize in any sense these different philosophical schools, but I'm just kind of getting you to be thinking about, what would maybe some of these sort of schools place emphasis on. Whereas a Greek-influenced philosopher, he might ask, can machines truly reason? What is the logical structure of artificial thought? How do we know if an AI understands or merely simulates understanding? And a Chinese philosopher might ask, how will AI affect our social relationships? What, rules and practices do we need to maintain harmony between humans and machines as they get more advanced? How do we govern AI wisely? And this is not to say that other traditions wouldn't ask these questions, but I think a good sign is, if you read any of this AI literature, is that we're kind of asking all of these questions, but we might not know sort of where the emphasis on these types of questions comes from, and missing that emphasis would kind of lead us to maybe looking for answers in the wrong place, where we could go back to that specific philosophical tradition to see if they had, answers that would be illuminating for us in our current moment. And so each perspective, the point here is that each perspective sort of illuminates different aspects of the challenge, and to be aware of where we are, what kind of emphasis we're putting on a certain problem like artificial intelligence. It's good to be aware of all of them in order to know where to look for the answers. Now, again, I talked about how translation was very difficult. And translation between traditions can lead to misunderstandings, but it can also be very philosophically productive. So when we struggle to find an English equivalent for dharma, or puzzle over whether Tao should be translated as the way or reason, or just left untranslated, we're forced to think more carefully about what these concepts really mean. And sometimes the failure to translate perfectly is in itself instructive. To shy away from that just because it's very difficult, I think we should avoid this at all costs, because, given its difficulty, the fact that, say, moksha doesn't quite mean salvation and isn't quite liberation tells us something important about both Indian and Western assumptions about the human condition. These translation gaps are sort of windows into different ways of carving up conceptual space. And, this isn't just an academic exercise. This is getting a little ahead of myself. Sorry. This isn't just an academic exercise. We live in an unprecedented age where these traditions actively encounter each other. And so, we're all sort of philosophical hybrids now, whether we realize it or not. In the U.S., at least, we had a big influence of Indian tradition in the 1960s and 70s. Many people made pilgrimages over to India and brought back with them, yoga, certain Indian ways of thinking, and even the gurus themselves. They came to America to teach their philosophical traditions. And, the question isn't whether to engage with multiple traditions, but how to do so thoughtfully without creating an incoherent hodgepodge of appropriating superficiality, which is kind of what we get from these sort of, I don't want to call them sophists, but sort of people with an agenda who sort of co-opt, whether it's the Stoic movement or the yoga movement. We have to be aware of these grifters and these fraudsters, co-opting these philosophical traditions. And so here's my suggestion. We approach each tradition with what we might call critical empathy. We try to understand each philosophy on its own terms by reading good translations of specific important texts within each philosophical tradition, using its own categories and assumptions rather than, our own Western assumptions. But the key here is not to surrender your critical faculties, right? You can still, and you should, ask hard questions. If there are tensions and problems, point them out. Test claims against experience, use logic, use deductive reasoning, use your own perception and evaluative methods in order to test the strengths and weaknesses of different philosophical traditions. Don't just explain, because it's a foreign philosophical tradition to me, then I can't really question it or anything like that. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Most importantly, what I'm trying to get at is, to recognize that no single tradition has all the answers because they prioritize different questions and because they have different assumptions that lead them to different answers to those fundamental questions. India's philosophical sophisticated analysis of consciousness doesn't negate neuroscience, or, the Greek logic doesn't invalidate meditative insight. Chinese situational ethics doesn't eliminate the need for universal axiological principles. And to kind of crystallize this suggestion and this idea, I kind of came up with a thought experiment. And it's based on a different thought of experiment. I can't remember who exactly said it, but it's sort of a modification of it. So imagine, if you will, 3 climbers approaching the same mountain from different sides. One starts from a desert and develops techniques for conserving water and navigating by the stars. Another starts from a jungle and becomes expert at clearing vegetation and avoiding predators. And the third begins at the coast or something like it, and masters, weather prediction and rope work and, building a ship or whatever. When they meet near the summit and compare notes, should they argue about who has the correct approach? Should they pretend they all took the same path? Or should they recognize that each developed valuable techniques adapted to their starting point, and that sharing knowledge will help them all in wherever they start next? So maybe it's a crude or slightly, simplistic thought experiment, but I wanted to make the point that philosophy is sort of like this. Different traditions started from different cultural landscapes, developed different tools, emphasized different challenges. Now, as our world becomes increasingly interconnected, we have the extraordinary opportunity to learn from all of them, not to create some bland synthesis, but to expand our toolkit, to see from multiple perspectives, to recognize the important differences between different cultures and not try to just say, they're all equally good or whatever, not to give up our critical faculties for evaluation. Because we need the best tools from each philosophical tradition in order to approach wisdom from multiple angles. And that's the only true way, I would argue, to truly gain wisdom. Now, so the goal isn't to become philosophically homeless or, abandon all traditions for some impossible view from nowhere or something like that. This is sort of a minority view, but nor is it to become a dilettante, to superficially sample without deep engagement. And I use the dilettante word begrudgingly, because Schopenhauer actually is a great thing about how dilettantes are actually they write the best stuff, they do the best philosophy and write the best books, because, and this is sort of a Chinese sort of thinking, as like the amateur is better than the professional, and you shouldn't be a professional artist or take money for certain things because it corrupts the work itself. So what I'm basically getting at is don't superficially sample without deep engagement. It's not an appetizer plate for you to pick off of, basically. The goal is really to be rooted in understanding, even if that means understanding multiple traditions deeply enough to see both their strength and limitations. And that's not easy, and it takes a lot of work, but I guarantee it is very fruitful work indeed. So we've covered tremendous ground today, and I'm going to wrap up with a few closing thoughts. We've seen 3,000 years of human thought sort of condensed into about an hour here. And I just want to kind of pull them together a bit and see where they point, where the road ahead points towards, because I think it'll be very interesting and very engaging. So we've seen these three orientations to wisdom: the Indian darsana, the Greek philosophia, and the Chinese she shui. And the key idea here is that these aren't competing answers to the same test. In fact, they're different examinations entirely. And what does that mean for us today? Well, we stand at a unique moment in history. For the first time, we have easy answers, we have easy access to all these traditions. The Upanishads can sit next to Plato on your bookshelf. You can study Buddhist logic and then Greek metaphysics all in the same week. And this is completely unprecedented. But access is an understanding. Having the information about these traditions isn't the same thing as thinking with them, really understanding them, letting them reshape how you see the world, how you understand and come to know that. And that takes time. It takes patience and a certain amount of intellectual courage, a willingness to have your assumptions challenged, to study things that may be outside of your comfort zone, and to discover that what seemed obviously true might be merely culturally familiar. So as we move forward in exploring these traditions more deeply through specific important philosophers within each tradition, I want you to keep a few things in mind. First, to resist the urge to pick winners and losers right away, because I think it's tempting to decide that one tradition or one specific philosopher got it right and that the others are confused. But it's usually a sign that we haven't understood something deeply enough, or that we're sort of not giving it the benefit of the doubt because these traditions have survived thousands of years, and so they obviously offer something essential if they are able to survive that long. Something resonates with human experience. The second thing is to pay attention to what puzzles or even disturbs you. If the Indian claim that individuality is ultimately illusory, if that seems absurd or uncomfortable, sit with that discomfort. If the Greek confidence in reason strikes you as naive, examine why that may be so. If the Chinese subordination of individual to society feels oppressive, explore that reaction. Don't shy away from it. Our resistance often marks exactly where we have the most to learn. And third, I want you to notice how these ancient debates remain alive today. When neuroscientists debate whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, there are continuing arguments that began in the Upanishads. When political theorists argue about individual rights versus social harmony, they're replaying debates from ancient China. And when educators argue about teaching critical thinking versus practical skills, they're navigating tensions the Greeks first articulated. So, sort of really wrapping up here, philosophy at its best isn't a series or set of doctrines to memorize. It's more of a conversation to be joined. The sages of the Upanishads, the Pre-Socratic philosophers, the masters of the 100 schools, they're not distant historical figures, but voices in an ongoing dialogue about fundamental questions that remain as urgent today as they were 3,000 years ago. What is real? How can we know it? How should we live our lives? These questions don't have final answers, or rather, each generation must work out its own answer using the tools and insights previous generations have provided us. And so this conversation continues, and now you're part of it. We all bring our own questions and our own experiences, our own cultural context to these debates. So you're not just learning about philosophy here. What I want is that you're doing philosophy. We're doing it together. We're adding our voices to this ancient ongoing debate. Thoroughly, it's a very human endeavor. It's one of the most well-documented and ancient human endeavors that we have. This need or this trying to understand what it means to be conscious beings in a very mysterious universe. And so, just to remind you, we began today not in Athens, but in the forest of ancient India. And this was to make a point that, wisdom has no single birthplace. It sort of sprouted up in 3 different places all at once. And probably the deepest point, the final thing I'll leave you with, is that philosophy has no final destination. It's not a problem to be solved, but again, a conversation to be sustained. So as we continue our philosophical journey here, whether through formal study on your own or personal reflection or watching these videos, remember that the goal isn't to find the one true philosophy. It's to become more thoughtful, more aware, more capable of navigating the complexity of our existence in our current moment. It's to join this conversation and to begin having the tools and the resources necessary to do so in a thoughtful and an intentional way. So that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching and listening. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more videos. I will see you in the next one.